Hello and welcome to another episode of the Exponential Australia Church podcast, as we hear from a wide range of Aussie Christian leaders when it comes to all different things that are happening around Australia and around the world when it comes to church leadership, church planting. And today we're joined by a friend of the podcast in Beck Wilesmith. Beck works with the team Micah Australia. Beck, it is so wonderful to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. This is great. I'm excited.
So good. Hey, before we get into Micah and the different ways that you're seeing the church mobilised in Australia, different things that you're a part of in your work with Micah, I'd love to just get a bit of a thumbnail about Beck, about yourself, about the different things that you do, your family, some of your journey up until now. Tell us about yourself before we get stuck into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So I'm based in Newcastle, New South Wales, an amazing part of Australia. For those who are listening and have been to Newcastle, or I encourage you to come if you never have. I'm married to Matt Wilesmith, but more so known as Wiley. So if I ever refer to Wiley in this conversation, that's my husband. We have two young boys, Jack and Alfie. We wear a few hats, as most people do these days when it comes to work and vocation and ministry. We are both credentialed pastors through the ACC, and we belong to Hope Unlimited Church it's a church across Newcastle and the Central Coast, but we are a part of the key team there. We have been in youth ministry for a number of years, so youth pastors, and currently very honoured to be the state directors for Youth Alive, New South Wales, which is an amazing organisation.
Absolutely.
And then Wiley is also a teacher. That's sort of his background and vocation. And I'm on staff at Micah, which we'll talk about. But look, just very briefly, my background, it's essentially in communications. That's what I studied. I did a brief 2-year stint working for a politician. I'd always had an interest in politics and just found myself with an incredible opportunity to work for a federal member of parliament quite a few years ago now. But I worked as a media advisor based in Sydney and travelled to Canberra. That was a great opportunity. I then changed direction quite a bit. And I ended up working for Compassion Australia, which a lot of your listeners will know, an incredible NGO, still very close to my heart. I was the communications manager there. And then I've stayed in the aid and development sector since, really. I now work for Micah Australia. I've been with Micah for about 6 years, working alongside Reverend Tim Costello and Matt Darvis, who's our national director, and a small team that we have here. So, communications was my background, and then have gone into aid and development landscape with a little bit of ministry thrown in on the side.
So good.
That's it.
I love that, Beck. Well, you've had a number of incredible experiences, both as you talked about in the church world, in the political world, and of course in the NGO world. And I wonder, just particularly for those who have always heard about Micah, I really think Micah packs a disproportionate punch. It's like one of those organisations that everyone's heard of, knows about. But if you were to really kind of distill down the work of Micah and what it's attempting to do across the church, within the church, for the church, and more, broadly, globally, tell us about the work of Micah.
Yeah, it's an incredible organisation. Really, to summarise it into one sentence, what we basically say is that we exist to empower Australian Christians to advocate on the most urgent global justice issues facing our world today. But we're a coalition, Micah, of Australia's largest Christian agencies, development agencies. So, your World Visions, your Baptist World Aid, Tear Fund, the Salvation Army, IJM, so many, 16 in total actually are Micah members. And the interesting thing about Micah, it was really born out of a desire for the church to respond to the Millennial Development Goals, which many people will be familiar with. And it was really that moment of we need to come together as the church and to contribute to this. We have a contribution to make. We need to get on board and advocate for change. And it's very much developed over the years. It's been going a number of years in Australia now, but I suppose where we've landed, and to explain what we do, we run a number of key initiatives and campaigns, some of we'll touch on today. And through those, we really are about supporting and resourcing Australian Christians to engage with federal politicians about getting significant outcomes on key issues of global justice. So a main area we focus on is the Australian aid budget. We also focus on other humanitarian issues along the way. And really, we see ourselves as trying to give a voice to the Australian church when it comes to issues of justice, particularly around those living in extreme poverty. So we do a lot of different things, but hopefully that's a helpful summary.
No, that's so good. And I always love to ask, Beck, how did you get involved with Micah? Why is it something that drives your heart and passion for the things that you do for a vocation? Tell us about your heart for it.
Yeah, it's a good question. Mike has been such a gift to me because I'm one of those weird people that actually likes politics and finds it interesting. I'm a bit of a political nerd, and Micah for me has been this wonderful intersection of the church in Australia, which I'm really passionate about. I've grown up as a pastor's kid. I'm now a pastor myself. I love the church and all it stands for. And then there's this crossover between the church and politics, which is a bit of my sweet spot, which I know not everyone feels like that. Yes, we can talk about that too. But, I was working for Compassion and really loving my role there. I was doing a few different things and I was approached. Tim Costello had just come on board actually to sort of reboot Micah in 2018, and he brought Matt Darvis on board as well. And I had worked with Matt previously at Compassion. So one day, Matt, knowing my love for politics and a little bit of my background in it as well, gave me a call and offered me an opportunity to come and work with Micah. And from the outset, what I was really impressed with was the desire to come at this thing that we call advocacy, which I suppose really, if you were to sum up Micah in one word, it's advocacy. There was a real desire to have such a humble and professional approach to what we do. And Tim obviously brings that with his experience and background. But there was a real recognition of this is a moment for the Australian church. Things are getting, in a lot of ways, are getting worse in the world, although there's been key development issues that have improved over time. There's obviously big challenges in the world that we're tackling and facing. How can we bring our prophetic voice into that? How can we help equip and empower Christians to have these conversations with politicians and actually show politicians that we care about these things as the church? So, yeah, it was an easy yes for me in a lot of ways. And it's just been a beautiful journey to watch God. We're a small team, very small, and more resources in a lot of ways. But as we've just tried to bring what we can to the table and do what we see our role, it's just been amazing to see the impact actually with some of the public campaigns we've been involved in and the different networks and the different delegations to Parliament that I play a key role in. It's been incredible to see the impact and to see the church's response. Yeah.
So good. It feels to me, just as an outsider, as an observer of your journey, that's an absolute convergence of the way that the Lord's using you in that role, and your skills, abilities, and passions and aptitudes. And you used a word there before that I'd love to mine into just a little bit more, just for our listeners who may be wanting to know more about advocacy. And elsewhere, we talked about relational advocacy, like that's the work that you are doing at Micah, relationally advocating on behalf of the poor to politicians within church, like on behalf of the church, which I think is a really important distinction. And just the way that you hold that space well, like help our listeners understand how do you relationally advocate?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, relational advocacy. We talk about it a lot at Micah. Micah, by the way, has its name from Micah 6:8. That might be obvious, but it's always nice to remind people of that. It's after the prophet in the Bible, and that beautiful scripture about He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. So for us, relational advocacy, it's about the posture and tone that we take when we're meeting with politicians, whether that's our interactions in person, which most of them are, or through campaigns or online. Our posture is actually one of humility and care for the politician, but it's also prophetic. So it's speaking truth to power.
Wow.
So we take a bit of a different approach. We're not, I wouldn't call our Micah supporters and what we do, it's not sort of activists or protesters. Now, obviously, protesting and activism have a place in democracy, so I'm not diminishing those at all. But that's not the strategy that Micah takes. It's very much about seeking to develop relationships for the long term in order to get the best outcomes. So, I think of it as that picture of sitting down at the table with someone to have a conversation and to actually find common ground. And I think that's actually quite a biblical model, Charlie, when you think about our faith. Let's sit down with these politicians. Let's find the common ground, because we know, and I know from my experience, that the majority of politicians, doesn't matter which party, whether it's Greens, Independents, ALP, Coalition, most of those men and women seek to serve because they have a good heart and they want to bring positive change to their communities. Now, of course, for me personally or Michael, we don't agree with every policy that they're advocating for or their personal beliefs, but we find that we can often find that common ground, and that there's a lot of goodwill, I'll say, in the parliament, actually, especially when it comes to issues of those living in poverty and justice issues. So our approach is to, well, let's find this common ground and how can we work together to get a good outcome? But of course, within that, how can we challenge you? Like, we are going to be prophetic and speak truth to power and hold up a vision of what we believe Australia could be doing, how we could be giving more or doing more. So we don't shy away from those tough conversations. And I've been in those conversations where it can be challenging if there's disagreement. But our two of our values in terms of relational advocacy are humility and the prophetic. So we try to hold that tension well. Yeah.
So good. So good. Well, I want to just pause there for a moment, because of course our listeners could be wondering, on our Church Leaders podcast, why are we diving into politics? Why are we diving into justice, which I would say is actually at the very core of who God is and therefore who the church is called to be as well. Sometimes, unfortunately, that can be misaligned. But I wonder if you could just, as we kind of bring our listeners in on the significance of this, speak to, I guess, some of the political polarization that, of course, we're all seeing and experiencing in the world at the moment. It's been a global trend over the last number of years, the sensitivity around politics and justice, and even maybe sometimes the taboo nature of talking about these kind of things as church leaders. Sometimes we feel like maybe we've given up in the past and we've put our foot in our mouth, or maybe we've made some mistakes that we've seen, or maybe the church leader down the road's made a mistake and we've gone, I don't want to put myself in that kind of boat. Particularly someone who is advocating on behalf of the church to politicians. What are maybe some of the things that you're seeing and observing about how we can do that in a really helpful and nuanced way?
Yes, it's a hard topic and it's a hard thing, and I think it's only getting a little bit more complicated. But I think it goes back to what you said just then about justice. The call for biblical justice, it's a call for all Christians. And I think every Christian would agree with that, right? About what the Bible talks about in terms of speaking up for the poor and what we can do. But then I understand that the question becomes, well, how do we do that? So it's like every Christian knows there's a call to justice, but we don't always know the right way to do that or the opportunity to do that. And I think it's really important for the church to not retreat during this time, because it feels easier, especially in this day and age and this political climate, to retreat from the political things. But I'm really passionate about Christians engaging, not retreating, but engaging. And I think there is a right way to engage in terms of our humility, and we don't have to compromise on our faith and what we believe. But Charlie, I think we sometimes forget the honor and privilege it is to live in a democracy. And there's millions of people upon the earth that don't live in a democracy.
Yeah.
that don't have that opportunity to use their voice and to speak up. The parliament belongs to us as the people, really. And I think when it comes to poverty and issues of justice, it's important to note that, there's still 700 million people living in extreme poverty in the world today. So when Christians sort of say, oh, we don't want to get involved in politics and, it's just about the church doing more, well, we just know that that's not going to be solved simply by churches giving more.
Yeah.
That needs a bigger approach. That needs the government involved. And that needs, we need change at a policy level. So we're really passionate about that at Micah, that actually for change and transformation for the world's most vulnerable, that we know that we are called to, right? The widow and the orphan and the stranger and foreigner and those living in poverty, it actually needs change at a policy level. And, I do get, as a pastor myself, the hesitation, but I think, we can still engage and encourage our people to engage in politics, without, it's not about promoting a particular party. It's about reminding all of us about actually our responsibility living in this amazing nation, Australia, a democratic privilege that we get to exercise. And that actually, I think Christians forget that politicians want to hear from us. They want to hear from people, from constituents. And when that's done in the right way, it can be a really fruitful exercise. I love what Tim Costello says, to quote him. One of his mantras is, don't go left or right, go deeper when it comes to politics. So we don't have to choose a side. We live in this polarized world where it's like, pick a side, every issue that comes up, pick a side, pick a party. But actually, as Christians, we know that we serve a higher kingdom, the kingdom of God. But that doesn't mean that we just don't engage and that we retreat from anything political. And just to give you one really quick example of how I've seen this work really well, and it's a recent example of how the Australian church came together. You'll probably remember back in 2021, when the Taliban came in and took over Afghanistan, and there was just a lot of fear and devastation about what was happening. Micah quickly pivoted and joined with other agencies to create a campaign called Christians United for Afghanistan.
Wow.
And this was a campaign that we really quickly pulled together. We put it out to the Australian church and said, hey, we all saw the images, right, of people fleeing that nation. I mean, it was just sheer terror and what was going to happen, especially to women and girls and those that are vulnerable. So we pulled together this campaign, us and others, and it was just incredible, Charlie, to see the church respond. It was the church in Australia in action. And through a number of months, we had many people sign up and meet with MPs and, do all the different actions that we asked the church to. And really that campaign was pivotal in securing an additional 16,500 places for Afghan refugees to come to Australia.
Wow.
And that was after actually the Australian government, they'd already announced and said, we know what's happening, but we're only going to provide 15,000 places from within the existing refugee program or humanitarian program. But, we really saw the church step up in that moment and say, hey, no, we want to welcome these people. We need to increase our refugee spaces. We need to increase our current program to provide additional spaces. And that happened. And I mean, think about the impact on those families and lives and being able to come to Australia. And I just often reflect on that campaign that we were honoured to play a part in. And it was just beautiful, from the Catholics and the Lutherans, the Pentecostals, the Anglicans, the Baptists, hundreds of churches jumped on board. And, that was an example of the church engaging in politics, really.
Yes.
And look at that amazing outcome. So, yeah.
That's incredible, Beck, and thank you for sharing that example, because that's a beautiful example, one that I'm sure will catch the attention of our listeners. And I guess where I want to shift the conversation to now is particularly on a local level. Like, if we're talking about church leaders, church planters wanting to play their role on a local level, what would be some encouragements that you might be able to offer in terms of how they can come alongside, work with, partner with, not always be the ones who are necessarily campaigning against at actually, working with local politicians, particularly if we're honest, because, when it comes to church planting, we want to see communities transformed. We want to see towns and suburbs and cities actually experience the good news of Jesus, which is both physical and spiritual. And so how can we do that in a really helpful way when it comes to local politicians and local issues?
Yes, well, firstly, hats off to anyone church planting. My parents were pastors and I saw that sort of firsthand, and absolute heroes, honestly. So well done. I think especially for a new church leader in an area or a church plant, and I'll put my former political staffer hat on here, but one of the things that I think would be so effective and practical is to actually go and meet with your both federal MP and state MP and let them know, hey, we're a new church plant in the area and we actually want to hear from you. What do you see as some of the real issues in this community that we could maybe get on board with? What are the good things happening, so that we don't want to duplicate what's already happening and the good things in the community? And just ask them, like, how can we support you? What do you need from us? And I can tell you that would blow their socks off, honestly. Because they're not probably having many of those meetings where people are saying to them, how can we support you and this community? Often with politicians, it's people coming to them, asking them for things, of course, and that's fine because that's part of their job. But, when it comes to churches, probably the best examples of churches really ingrained in their local communities and making a difference, the best examples I've seen is when they are actually actively working with their local politicians, whether it's the mayor, whether it's the state member or federally. They've worked to develop that relationship over the long term. And again, you don't have to agree on everything, but often you'll find that there's like 2 or 3 areas that they're passionate about. And you might be like, oh, you're concerned about young people being isolated? Hey, we're going to be running a youth ministry on a Friday night. Oh, homelessness is an issue, or this or that. Hey, we could help with that. And, there's just so many ways that then there can be that beautiful partnership, I think, and collaboration. Not on everything, of course, but yeah, my time as a staffer, I just thinking back, that was the best examples I saw. And I think that's a real key, because you'll probably also find that not many people know the local community better than a politician, actually, especially if there's someone that's been there for many years. They'll really understand a lot of the local needs, and I'm sure there'll be incredible opportunities then to work together.
So good. Great practical suggestions, Beck. The area I want to focus on just for the last part of our conversation today is particularly with relation to Micah Women's Leaders Network. They've been doing some amazing gatherings around the country and particularly converging from Canberra annually. And this has kind of been something that in many ways is, of course, a coalition of women, but it's been something that has been your baby. You've been leading it, something you've been very, very passionate about. I wonder if you could kind of just speak to the heart of that, the different ways that people can get involved, what it's trying to seek to achieve, and just what you're seeing, I guess, in opportunities to gather women together around some of these significant issues.
Yes, I'd love to talk about this. This is something I've had the honour of being involved with from day one, Charlie. And to be honest, back in 2018, when Tim, Matt and myself came on board with Micah, and there was different conversations around, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to take a bunch of church leaders to Canberra? Where do we want to go with this? And the idea arose, hey, what if we actually took female church leaders and Christian leaders to Canberra? And that wasn't just a gimmick, that was because we recognized that women are often at the forefront of social justice movements in the church. It's often the women doing the heavy lifting, whether that's leading the community arm or the outreach or whatever it is in all its different arrays and expressions. And for me, I even think back to Colour Conference that I went to as a young teenager and as a young woman. And really, that was an incredible movement of women around biblical justice. And that was really formational for me in understanding God's heart for justice in the church. So long story short, we back in 2018, took a group of 9 women to Canberra. We didn't really know what we were doing, but it was incredible. We got to meet with the Prime Minister, and really the feedback from the politicians, they wanted to hear from church leaders. So out of that was born the Micah Women Leaders Network, and that has evolved over those 5 or 6 years to a network of about 500 women, which is just incredible. And, the goal has really just remained the same, and that's to facilitate this network and advocate once again on the most pressing global justice issues through influential political engagement. So I'm always blown away that by the women, the caliber of women that come to Canberra. These are incredible women, once again, wearing all the different hats. They might be CEOs of an NGO, they might be a senior pastor, they're doing lots of things, but they take the time to come to Canberra and to advocate for the world's poor. And it's just been, really, we're starting to see it as a movement, because that's what it is. It initially started out as just for those in leadership, but we're really sort of opening it up now, because we recognize that women have such a key role to play when it comes to community transformation and social change. So just a couple of weeks ago, we got back from our 6th delegation. It was incredible. We had 35 women in Canberra. Once again, many denominations, 12 denominations of the church represented. We met with 42 politicians, and really importantly, Charlie, we focused on one of the new campaigns, that Micah is running. And I'd love to just take like a minute to talk about this.
Go for
it's
it.
it's quite crucial. We're in the lead up to the next election, which, if you know politics, it's a pretty important time. Politicians are starting to listen, right? Because we're going to vote or not vote for them again.
Yeah.
But the Safer World for All campaign is really looking at the multiple crises happening around the world and its impact on the most vulnerable. So, we don't need to go through them. We know sort of some of the global instability that's happening. And, as I mentioned, 700 million people still living in extreme poverty. 1 in 5 children around the world now live in a conflict zone. Like, that's a staggering statistic and a reflection of what is happening. And so this campaign, and this is what we were doing while we're in Canberra, it was quite amazing. We're basically advocating for an increase to the foreign aid budget, which is actually at a historic low. So most people think in our federal budget, there's been some data and research done on this. Most people think we give about 3% of our federal budget to aid. It's actually 0.68%.
Wow.
And that's compared to what it was even under John Howard. Under his government, it was 1.12%. So it's been in decline for many years, and we won't go into all that. There's many different reasons and things that have happened. But what we're advocating for, Charlie, with this campaign is that it will increase to just 1% of our federal budget. And we have to recognise that while Aussies are doing it tough, no one's denying that, that still leaves 99% of our budget for all our domestic needs, and what's happening here. But 1% of our federal budget going towards ODA, which is basically aid spending, would just make an incredible difference for our neighbours, for those in the Pacific, for those, across Southeast Asia, for those doing it tough. And so that's what the ask is. We're really asking all major parties to commit to that in the lead up to the election. The Women Leaders Network are advocating on that, but also actually there's opportunities at the moment. We are targeting 40 key seats in the lead up to the election all across Australia. We're actually giving church leaders and pastors, both men and women, an opportunity to go and meet with that MP, and we train that little group for that. We give them all the resources needed, but we're really wanting to see a ripple effect and go to politicians and say, where's the church in the lead up to the election? Now, this isn't the only issue we care about, of course, but it is one of them. We care about whether or not Australia are going to be a generous neighbour and rise up and be generous in this time of instability around the world. So, I could go on and on about the campaign, but that's the overall ask. That's what we're aiming for. So people can get involved with that. People can get involved with the Micah Women Leaders Network. micahaustralia.org. I think that's our website. I hope. But yeah, lots of good things happening, and I'm really excited for what's to come.
So good, Beck. Well, we definitely want to encourage any of our listeners who are hearing some of this for the first time, going, how can I get involved? How can I play my role in this to follow you guys up online and part of the Women Leaders Collective. Beck, we are so glad that you're able to be with us on the podcast today to share a multitude of different things that you are doing, that you're involved with, that Micah is doing on behalf of the Church in Australia. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.